Hi! This time I wanted to talk about sandboxes in role playing games. And I also wanted to inform you that there are three very good videos in my opinion, that were produced by 28 millimeters RPG. I'm going to put a link to the videos and his channel in the description below. I think his channel is pretty good. I recommend that you watch it because there are a few channels that I think still analyze the core of true role-playing games. They do not get caught up in some trends, or sometimes people get too entangled in the superficial aspects of role-playing games and they forget the essentials, such as having fun, the structure of an adventure, of a campaign, how you interact with with player characters and non-player characters, with the players themselves, with the game master, etc. So I highly recommend that you check out his channel. In this video, I am going to give you just some general thoughts on sandboxes. Perhaps some of the things that I talk about will overlap a bit with the videos produced by 28 millimeters RPG. His videos are actually really good in my opinion when it comes to in those sandboxes videos, when it comes to the non-player characters actually feeling alive with their own agendas and motives, the way that they carry out their daily existences, etc. I'm going to start this video by talking about how I got into the concept of sandboxes without knowing what a sandbox actually was. Some of you know that I got my start with Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games by playing the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons box set. I think that box set, although it is good in some respects, in some regards, it is quite lacking when it comes to a greater scope of the game. And the player's handbook and the game master guide of AD&D second edition, they do not present an adequate introduction in my opinion. There are many things that you cannot learn. That is, back then when you didn't have like many internet videos telling you how to play role-playing games and all of that, you had no idea on how to run campaigns of a larger scope, traversing the countryside, having all sorts of encounters, not just within adventure sites and the dungeon, but in forests and swamps and mountains, going to villages and cities. Villages, cities, and all of that, anything civilized that felt more like a temporary hub when it comes to the introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons box set and the three core books, or rather two core books. That's why I love the Forbidden Lands role-playing game so much, the box set, because it really gets you into both styles of playing. That is more let's go into the dungeon, take on the enemies, take their stuff, and a style that focuses more on moving between different adventure sites, not just within a single adventure site. You're visiting different places and you actually feel like you are on a journey, traveling across the countryside. So the introduction to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons box set from back then, it really lacked or was quite weak in that regard. So when I first started, you only had those three adventures: the dungeon that featured Bone Gnasher the ogre, the haunted mansion sort of adventure, and the I forgot the name of the third adventure. It was kind of like um, let's say a more easygoing, now how would you say it, an easier version of Under Mountain. There were some dangerous situations there, but compared to Under Mountain, that third dungeon, it felt like a bit like Under Mountain for beginners. And none of those had any encounters outside of the adventure sites. So for me, at first it was somewhat difficult to understand those situations when my players thought about, oh, we need money for this to buy better equipment or to get some magical items. And they were like, let's go an adventure around town. So my first improvised encounters, by making some random encounters as I understood them back then, they were really lackluster in my opinion. They almost felt like a JRPG or a video game where you are walking around an area and suddenly the screen flashes and you are into a fight and that was it. There was no flavor to the encounters that the player characters would face outside of those adventure sites. It was only when I started to purchase modules of Adventures for Ravenloft and I got into other adventures featuring the Forgotten Realms, those adventure modules had scenarios that featured different places, not a single dungeon or adventure site, different places, towns, people that you needed to talk to, separate adventure sites. So for me, it felt somewhat terrifying at first because it's like I felt too secure within the confines of the dungeon. So I thought, how can I handle this? They say that you need to travel across this swamp and moving from this city to this place where there was a caravan, and then you need to go to this other city. It felt quite overwhelming. So I decided to look at things as if it was all a huge dungeon. And immediately I told my players that this was my first time running things. And still, for example, when I run sandboxes in more recent times, I tell my players, well, we're going to have a campaign in this particular section of the land. You could explore outside of the designated area, but there could be, for example, if they go into sea, just like they take a ship and they start just keep going and going, there could be some dangerous sea monsters beyond their capabilities. There could be some natural phenomena like storms, and depending where they are moving through, like cyclones, etc. In the case of moving across the land, there could be some wars, some kingdoms at war with each other, and they could get caught up in the conflict. So you do need to create sometimes those barriers that seem natural or alive within the setting if you don't want the players to stray too far away from things. You could be thinking that it's a sort of railroad, but it's like in real life. You are following a particular objective. You do not go to a particular place unless you have an objective or a goal in mind. So when you go to work, that's because you're going to earn money. When you go to a park, you go to relax. When you go to a restaurant, you go to eat. You just don't start walking in a particular direction and see what happens. You can do that, but it could be quite pointless, boring, and dangerous. Pointless, boring, and dangerous. I think those are the three reasons why player characters that start just wandering off in a direction without an objective, the entire campaign could proceed in a negative way. If nothing happens, they could get bored, and they could encounter some dangers beyond their capabilities, like I mentioned, of the sea monsters, if they are going into a mountain and they bump into a dragon. There could be all sorts of situations like that. And that's something that 28mm RPG mentions in his video, that the players really need to get committed. They need to feel committed or proactive, I would say, in taking on this sandbox experience. So maybe you place the characters in a campaign featuring various kingdoms. They can move across the different kingdoms, but they really need to be driven. If they're just, like he said in his video, that they go into a town and they set up shop and that's it, they become non-player characters, they become shopkeepers, and that's where the adventure ends. So that's pointless and quite silly. There are actually some role-playing games that can handle such situations, but they are not sandbox experiences. There is a role-playing game, Golden Star? No. I don't remember the name, but it's by Ewan Clooney, the guy who has been translating a lot of Japanese RPGs. And you're basically playing as a shopkeeper. I haven't played that game yet, but all of the action, the conflicts, and all of that take place within that shop. So in that case, it could work, but it has nothing to do with the sandbox. I was thinking you can actually work a sandbox experience into that if the players need to go outside of their shop to get some resources items, whatever they are selling, some seeds if they are selling foodstuffs and such. So you could have an interesting sandbox experience like that. If you want to set up shop, depending on what you are selling, maybe it's a weapon shop, you need to find that valuable ore. Maybe you go on adventures to find those mines. Or maybe you are selling something else, like I said, maybe you sell healing herbs and you're looking for a very rare herb or seed and you're going on a quest to find those things. That's the only way in which you can carry out a sandbox campaign with a somewhat stationary lifestyle, because even though you are stationary, you're staying in your item shop or weapon shop or whatever, you are still going into the world. It's like in real life. If you do not take action, nothing is going to happen. If you just stay where you are without doing anything, you're not going to meet people, you're not going to earn money, you're not going to survive. So it's quite silly when some players approach sandbox campaigns without that drive, that desire to explore the world. So it does depend a lot on the players. I think that in most cases, if some player isn't exploring, isn't feeling eager to take on the different quests and adventure seats within a sandbox setting, I think that player is just looking. He or she has some personal issues, and he or she is taking it out on the game. So yes, it's all about having a group that is willing to actually play as adventurers. And to encourage that, you need to plant many different seeds in your sandbox. Many opportunities for adventure. Maybe you have like the typical scenario where there is this tavern or a guild house and you have this board where they post all sorts of mission requests, or could you help me find this non-player character? Could you find this valuable item for me? In a sense, many video games take that approach, but when it comes to a tabletop role-playing game experience, you can see how some video games like Oblivion, they have tried to emulate that experience, but it never fully works. That's why I got so bored when playing Elder Scrolls Oblivion. Not only because many of the sites were randomly generated with no detail to them, they all felt so much of the same. And the activities of the different non-player characters, although they surpassed other role-playing games, they felt quite just like pre-programmed, artificial. They never deviated from the routine. Like you were like, the first time you played Oblivion, you were like, oh, this non-player character is moving from this place to this other place, and then you keep on playing and that non-player character keeps doing the same thing over and over and over again. One thing that 28mm RPG mentioned in his, I think it was his third video, it was that sometimes alignments change. Maybe a character that was neutral or perhaps even good or bad, they changed their alignment completely, radically so, related to events within the sandbox setting. I think that's also something that scares some people, because there are going to be many things happening at the same time in the sandbox environment. You need to be well organized. You need to take your notebook and keep track of the things that have been happening. Just keep it at your own pace. There is no hurry if you, or a strict way in which you can do that. You can just make some key notes that, oh, the player characters raided this adventure site and now it is empty. So this other group of adventurers arrives to that place and they were actually quite evil, and they want to steal the things that the player characters took from that site, and now they are following the party of adventurers. Or what happens if a group of adventurers, the player characters, help this non-player character. Maybe that non-player character was of evil tendencies, but because he was helped in a moment of need, maybe he had that very weird moment. Maybe you could determine that by making a roll where he actually changes his alignment. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe there was this other non-player character that was of neutral alignment, or was perhaps, yes, lawful good, neutral good, chaotic good, and the player characters start helping that non-player character too much. and he starts to take advantage of them. So now his alignment is no longer good. It tends towards more neutral evil. Perhaps he starts sending them on quests that are quite dangerous, but he doesn't care because he has been treated so well by the party of adventurers that he's now taking advantage of them. So it's all about those changes in the personality and the lives of the non-player characters. When it comes to seeding your sandbox setting, I highly recommend that you place many interesting sites that, even if they do not have treasure or monsters, they encourage, or the players feel drawn to them because of the lore and the background story. They could even offer some clues that could be useful in other adventure sites or situations, or in cities and towns. So maybe there is this monument to this legendary hero, and the player characters decide to go to that monument because there is like a legend or a piece of folklore written at the base of the monument, and they, by analyzing that monument and what is written upon it, they decipher that there's a clue hidden that leads them to an adventure site where the treasures of the legendary hero were stored. Or maybe they go to another place like, oh, this beautiful lake, you need to see it, it's one of the most beautiful places. And because they arrived to that place, there are non-player characters there that also wanted to enjoy the lake, they wanted to swim in the lake or whatever, or go fishing. And they meet up with those non-player characters, and because of their conversations, they could tell them that there is a political unrest in this particular nation. It depends on the setting. Or maybe they tell them about this other non-player character in a town or in a village that is an expert craftsman, and he creates all sorts of superb weapons and magical items, or that he's interested in finding some artifacts. So the player characters feel just like drawn or encouraged to go to that non-player character and see if they can obtain perhaps some opportunities, like go on quests for that non-player character, or carry out businesses if they have their own shops. So yes, it's truly about that living sense of the world and keeping track of things. As a game master or dungeon master, you need to write down every change that happens, every significant change rather. You could ignore some minor things, especially when it comes to non-player characters that are not really important for the campaign. But when it comes to the alignment change, the changes of location of those key non-player characters, their attitudes towards the party of adventurers, the thing that the non-player characters do, the things that they do to affect kingdoms, perhaps even accidentally. Maybe they go to a particular party and they insult a very important character during that party, and they end up, depending on the laws of the kingdom, they end up in jail, or they suffer some sort of penalty or fee or whatever for his or her transgression. And then they tell the player characters about that. They know more about the particular city or town or whatever, and now the player characters have that information to have more successful social encounters in all sorts of gatherings related to that particular place. And there is always opportunity to advance the meta plot as they move through the sandbox. The player characters need to feel like if they are not taking action or specific actions, events will still move forward. So yes, going back to what I said, when I started to get into that sandbox experience, it was only several years later when I started to know that sandbox was actually a thing. For me, there was no clear definition, but I started to see everything as just one huge dungeon, but with no walls. In order for me to handle things in an easier way or more reassuring way, I just thought of that particular zone like, oh, it's kind of like a group of rooms in a dungeon. Or that town or city, it's kind of like those non-player characters that you encounter inside of a dungeon. Even if there are no walls, for a beginner game master, you can view things like that. Although, like I said, it's always better if you prepare those seats beforehand, roll up some adventure sites, some encounters, and you can have them available. You can have all of those encounters and seats available for whenever the player characters just step outside of the boundaries of that sandbox area. Even if you don't get to use those sites, and I actually recommend that you don't, because I think it adds authenticity to that sandbox. So maybe you are running the sandbox of the Curse of the Forgotten Mountains or whatever, and the players are moving in a way that they avoid many of the sites that you have prepared. Some game masters actually keep using those sites within the adventure that, oh, you didn't go into the Forbidden Grotto. Well, if you go into the caverns of the Dwarf King, now I'm going to use the map of the Forgotten Grotto in that place instead, but it feels so artificial like that. I would rather recommend that you either, for the next session, modify those adventure sites that they didn't visit, especially adapt those sites to the changes that have occurred during the course of the sandbox campaign. Change the enemies, change the architecture so that it fits an elven complex of sorts, or if it has to do with gnomes, adapt those. Perhaps you had a mausoleum and crypts, and now those mausoleums and tombs and crypts, they are now turned into huts or shacks for the gnomes, or underground dwellings. It depends. Or maybe just keep the adventure site as it is and use it in another sandbox campaign, because otherwise it's going to feel like the player characters have no choice. No matter if they choose to go to point A or point B or point C, you're going to always use adventure site X. So it's pointless. Otherwise, where is their choice? I think in the 28mm RPG videos, I think he mentions that. Yes, when he talked about the freedom of choice and all of that. So overall, I hope you found this video somewhat informative, especially if you are just getting into sandboxes. There are many game masters that never run sandboxes in their life, and I think that's a missed opportunity. It's all about creating that realistic environment that goes beyond the dungeon. In fact, that environment contains many potential adventure sites or dungeons. But take things at your own pace. I would recommend that, especially for beginners, if the players are just going too off rails, get ready to either improvise quite quickly, use any adventure site that you have at your disposal. Even if you have to modify an existing site, use it immediately. But you can always rely on those setting related hazards or properties to somewhat keep them away if they stray too much from the general zone. In the case of Ravenloft, that's an excellent setting for sandboxes, because the lords of the different domains, the Dark Lords, they can always close their borders in a supernatural way. They cause this mist, perhaps in the case of some domains, that paralyze the player characters if they step into them. Or they have these armies that appear almost out of nowhere that attack them if they try to cross the border. You can use those resources to your advantage if you are not ready for the players to explore another domain, and it still makes sense with the lore. In fact, I wonder sometimes if they also designed it that way, so that because Ravenloft can get quite complex. It's one of the settings of Dungeons and Dragons, the old school Ravenloft specifically, that back then they really broke the mold or stepped outside of the comfort zone for many, because they didn't focus too much on going on your typical dungeon crawl romp. There were many Ravenloft adventures and modules and campaigns where there is a lot of non-player character interaction and not many opportunities to just start to kill stuff and take their things. Yes, I think that's why I love the Ravenloft campaign setting so much. There are many ways in which you can run it. So I think that perhaps in the beginning they introduced that concept of closing the borders so that things wouldn't get too complicated. at first for the beginner players or those that decided to explore Ravenloft. So thank you for watching this video. Please check out the videos in the description below. I highly recommend them. And thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.